we'll start again for the second talk of this morning session. And so Daniel Rothschild, who's a philosopher of language and at UCL, University College London, and the head of the department there, is going to give a talk on propositions, which is called Beyond Propositions from Hamblin to Yablo. And the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone who's organized this, for putting this together in these incredibly difficult times. I've had, as you heard, 2 years to work on this talk. So I think, you should expect something really amazing. Unfortunately, you might be disappointed. But yeah, I'm actually not talking about propositions. I'm actually going to talk exactly about not propositions, or this move that Steve is a recent part of, that to move beyond propositions into kind of higher order, in a certain sense, objects to think about aspects of meaning. And yeah, just a brief, basically when I first heard Steve's lectures at Oxford, which were another version of the Hempel, a later, to some degree, derivation of the Hempel lectures, which then became the book Aboutness, my kind of immediate reaction was, you're talking about subject matter, but there's already a whole linguistics about questions and so on, and which covers a lot of the same ground, and you're not really talking about it. So I was trying to understand how these things relate. So I've finally got in my mind, I think, how they relate and what it is. So I'm going to try to say that. So the outline is going to be, first I'm going to talk about what I call the prehistory, stuff that happened, roughly before certain important events in the world, which I'll discuss after the prehistory. And this is on the linguists, the early linguistic work on questions, and philosophical as well. And then I'll talk about different ways of taking a linguistic entity, usually a sentence, and finding a set of propositions that associates with it in some way or another. And then I'll talk about Steve's contribution and these other, as many of you know, when Steve's book Aboutness came out, there were some other simultaneous events, both in the linguistic world and the philosophical world, which is from inquisitive semantics and the linguistics world, and Fine's work on truthmaker semantics, which relate to it. But I won't talk about Steve and not these other things, but I wanted to mention that these are parallel events. And then I'll talk about this distinction I want to make between internal and external sentential subject matters, which I think is very helpful for understanding how you locate Steve's subject matter within the picture of subject matter generally. So let's go to the prehistory. There's this amazing paper. So Charles Hamblin, I was going to say something. I was trying to find some good anecdote about him, but I couldn't really. But there's very many strange things about him. He's an Australian philosopher and logician and early computer scientist who, amazingly, of all the things he did, which include reinventing the push-down, push-up stack, the standard data structure, introducing reverse Polish notation into the world of computer science. Maybe not the first one to do it, but the one people remember from that, and various other things. It seems like the paper that's most cited by him has the inauspicious title of Questions in Montague English. And whenever anyone talks about Hamblin, at least outside this context right now, they're talking about that paper. What I'm talking about now, which is a 1973 paper, I think, we'll get to that date. But I'm talking about Questions 1958, which is an earlier paper, which people sometimes cite. I looked through all the citations. I think about half are just mistakes from people who are trying to cite Questions in Montague English and just, go on to the internet and say Hamblin Questions and find this paper. And then half are people who are actually interested in the paper. But he has this great, here's a quote from him. Traditionally, logicians have seldom, if ever, recognized questions as logical entities. In passing mentions, it has seemed to be their main concern to reduce them to statements of some kind. The prevalent attitude seemed to have been, anything which isn't a statement is meaningless, questions aren't meaningless, therefore questions must be elliptical statements. The only problem left is to find out what statements questions are. So he's responding to this kind of research strategy, which was prevalent to some degree in philosophy. You have a sentence, it could be, who are the children, or it could be, John is tall, whatever, some random sentence. You want to find a meaning to, and you think, let me look for the proposition. And then you can't find one, and you say, it's meaningless, or he also talks about, Wittgenstein statements about questions. Wittgenstein says, oh, it must be playing some other language game without giving analysis. And what's great about Hamlin's paper is he's the first that I know of person who says, okay, propositions are not working. Let's figure out a more complex entity that's going to do the work of giving us a serious logical analysis of these things. So he introduces a partition of logical space for understanding what a question is. And so in this way, he's in anticipation of later developments. Usually if you talk about people associating questions with partitions of logical space, you think of in linguistics, Grönendock and Stokoff's 1984 dissertation, which remarkably doesn't cite Hamblin 1958 for reasons I don't really know. I'm sure they were, well, maybe they didn't read it. But, in philosophy, we think of David Lewis not talking about questions, but talking about partitions of logical space to treat a subject matter. And Lewis well understood the connection to linguistic questions and mentions it in in some related papers. He picks it up from some other people who picked it up from Hamblin. But anyway, let me just talk about what the Hamblin idea about a denotation of a question is. So you have a question like who, and I'm just having an implicit set like of two people because that's the simplest, of Cleo and Lena got to wear the crown. So Hamblin says the meaning of a question is a statement, and it has to be all the answers, and the statements are the answers to the questions, and the total meaning is the set of all the statements there that are exhaustive of logical space and mutually exclusive, so a partition of logical space. And so just to we're all on the same page, something like Cleo but not Lena got to wear the crown, that's a good answer, because that excludes other answers. But Lena alone is not a good answer. Lena got to wear the crown, because that's compatible with Cleo wearing the crown or not. So those are what the good answers look. In sort of Venn diagrammy things, it's Venn diagrams without overlaps. Okay. So interestingly, and now I'm going to leave prehistory for a moment, something I hadn't thought about till I saw Steve mention this, is that this proposal immediately fails for some kinds of questions. This was not recognized in this literature. I don't know of it actually being talked about in linguistics literature exactly in this way. But if you take a question like, what are the number of stars, give or take 10, Steve doesn't phrase this in terms of questions, but it could just as well be phrased in terms of questions. There are complete answers here. There are between 993 and 1,003 stars. There are between 995 and 1,005 stars. These are complete answers, but they're not mutually exclusive, of course, because they can both be true in the same world. And you can even get, as Steve mentions, crediting Kit, I think, Kit Fine, that you can even get answers that logically entail each other if you have this other case. So in fact, even if you think about the linguistics of questions, you should already, even if you're still going with the exhaustive theory, or the kind of motivations for the exhaustive theory, you should also realize that you can't actually use a partition. You need some kind of better structure. Luckily, Hamblin already, in the famous paper, the paper that surprisingly is the most cited paper in his career because of its really inauspicious title, Questions in Montague English. And what's inauspicious about that title is, at least today, those of you who do semantics will know, if you see a paper that says Montague anywhere in the title, you know that if you have to read it, the first thing you have to do is spend 3 hours going back to Montague's, one of the founding Montague paper, remembering Montague's notation, which is an incredibly awkward notation, which almost stopped, semantics from actually happening. And then you have to go to this paper, Montague, great founder of semantics, but he almost killed it with his notation. Then you have to go back and read this paper about Montague English, understand it, translate it into some kind of reasonable way of reading it in your head at least, and then you have to spend the next day recovering and forget all of your Montague English. But nonetheless, despite this handicap, it's been cited 2,000 times, so he's done very well, or something like that. And here he's really interested in the linguistic question of how do you get from a sentence to a question. And here he drops, without mentioning his early paper, the notion of questions, answers as partitions, and rather he has this idea of the answer, the meaning of a question being something like a set of statements that we could call their atomic answers. So who came to the party would be, the set would be Mary came to the party, Natasha came to the party, Muhammad came to the party. These are all propositions. They're of course not mutually exclusive because everyone can come to the party. But that set of propositions is the meaning of the question. And there's, various semantic reasons, observations about how English works that makes that motivated. These are really worked on a lot more by Kartunen, who has effectively the same system, although it's a bit different in terms of some of the technical details. It's a function from world to answers, but we don't need to get into that here. So here the idea is something more like in sort of topological speak, the answers form a cover of the area where the question has an answer. That is, every world in which the question has an answer, there's a proposition that is the answer. There might be more than one, but there's at least one proposition. So it's this set of sets that's the covers. And also, and here's a crucial move, and in a sense I'll talk about how in Steve's work you have this move in a different form. What counts as an answer is kind of given in the syntax and semantics rather than in the pragmatics. In the original paper, it's just sort of like, let's just take the abstract notion of answer and think about what are all the complete mutually exclusive ones. Here, there's a kind of stipulation built in which makes Muhammad an answer and not, say, Muhammad or Natasha an answer. So you get certain answers and not others, basically by that are sort of stipulated in the definitions without any particular justification. I mean, he could give justification for what interest. So that's just, this is like, we go back to like normal Venn diagrams, if you want to think about the answer. Normal Venn diagrams with overlap, they're covers of the space they cover. Okay. So why was this prehistory? Well, it all happened a very long time ago. It happened before Steve graduated from Toronto, before an obscure film was made in the UK, incidentally, filmed in the UK anyway, because it was much cheaper then in the 70s with the oil crisis, before Groningen and Stokoff's dissertation, before Lewis, and before the work on focus, which I'll talk about in a minute. That's why that's all prehistory. I have there's no living memory of it in me. Okay, so the Hamblin program raises an important question, which is, okay, we have this idea of a set of propositions. I've forgot about partitions because we've seen partitions don't really work for Steve's reasons, if you even look at what Hamblin and Kartunen did, they don't seem to be the thing they want to do. But then the question is, how do you take a sentence and get a set of propositions? So I'm just going to talk about different ways people have done this, because kind of all these ways get put together in what happens later. So there's the Hamblin way, the Hamblin 73 way. You take a word like who, and you think the word who introduces it introduces all its possible reference in a way. I mean, it doesn't have reference, but like who introduces the set of all objects that could sort of stand in for who. I mean, you think about a sentence like, who got the crown, then you could fill in different entities for who got the crown. And you make the denotation of who just the set of all those different entities. And then you somehow, and this is, just some compositional magic done in Montague semantics, but you can do it in any framework you like. You have some rules in which that combines with the normal predicate, like went to the party, and gets you a set of proposition. So you're building up sets of propositions from the parts. If you're a linguist, you're really into what the compositional magic is, but for our purposes, we don't care. So the word who then introduces these alternatives. And what was interesting is that after this work, and I'm not doing this in any historical order, because I consider the bar is really low for history of the subject matter. The subject matter being subject, in that if you look at Aboutness or Kit Fine's paper, I mean, there's lots of discussion of historical figures, but there's no discussion at all of this kind of linguistic literature about questions or the discussion. So the subject matter is low. So merely even referring to this, I feel like, is raising the historical standards. So I don't have to present them chronologically. You have another use of Hamblin semantics, which is that in some languages, such as Korean and Japanese, hope Korean's right, pretty sure it's right, but it just kind of came to my mind. The words that you use for questions, what we call the WH words, are also indefinites. Sometimes. There's a few of these. And so this suggested to Angelica Kretzer, and now I'm forgetting Shimayama's first name, but Shimayama, a semantics for indefinites. It's way in which they introduce sets of possibilities. So you think of the value of what the word like a woman does is it introduces all the objects that are woman. It would just be like the same as which, like who, with a female gender. And then you have some other magic that makes sure that indefinite sentences don't express actual questions, but express existential quantification. But that's easy to do. You just sort of say, there's some operator in the sentence that kind of says, and one of these propositions is true, and then you get an indefinite. If you think about it, if you have some sort of system in which you have a set of propositions, one way of putting it forward would be, tell me which one is true. That's the kind of question way of putting it forward, something in the pragmatics, roughly speaking. But then another operation is you have something that says, not tell me which one is true, but I'm telling you one of these is true. That's the difference between a question and an indefinite. And where you put that, that's a matter for linguists to figure out. So that was one use. Another use goes back to Matsruth in this particular format, where you have focus values. So, observation that amazingly, I think goes back to Fred Dretske, which is that emphasis, focal intonation, can change the truth value of sentences. So I only introduce Bill to Sue is different from I only introduce Bill to Sue. So Dretske's main observation, I think is original to him, is that you have these sentences that are the same in all ways, but they clearly have different truth values. So Matsruth's treatment of this was to treat focus values, so the word like Bill focused, as introducing possibilities as well. So there's kind of this little F thing. Oh wait, I have a pointer. I have to use it at least once in the talk. F. See that there? That wasn't a typo or a necessity operator. It's not that there's any reason it would be, but that says giving me the focus value of this, and what it does is it gives you the set of propositions. I introduce Mary to Sue, I introduce Mark to Sue, so all the alternatives to Bill, probably including Bill itself as one of the alternatives. So that's the sort of cartoon version of Ruth's theory. But effectively, we have another trick in which we take a sentence and we use some kind of operation to get not a proposition, but a set of propositions. And in focus semantics, usually you kind of have two things going in parallel. The sentence has like its own proposition, and then it also has a focus value. But we don't need to get into details of this. I just want to talk about this as another trick where you have a sentence and you get a set of propositions rather than a proposition. And you see these tricks are very similar. You take some term and you introduce a bunch of possibilities based on those terms, and then you, by plugging those things in point-wise, you get a set of propositions. So, just to say, focus extremely useful. One of the things that it explains is question-answer congruence, just to sort of bring everything together. So the thought is, who came to the party? It's appropriate to say Lena came to the party. It's weird to say Nina came to the party. Well, if you think about one of the nice things about Ruth's theory of focus is question-answer congruence is just the identity of the focus value of the sentence with the semantic value of the question. The semantic value of the question is a set of propositions, including all the individuals who came to the party. And then the focus value of Lena came to the party is that same thing. So question-answer congruence is literally identity of a certain kind of object. There's lots of more things you can say about focus. So that's all on the linguistic side. I'm going to go back to prehistory for a moment. Because interestingly, and this feeds much more into Steve and Kit Pine's work, is that you also have a route to getting sets of propositions from sentences if you look at it kind of with your eyes, in the right kind of unusual way so that it's not reading it exactly straightforward, in Bos van Frossen's paper, Facts and Tautological Entailments. And I'm mentioning this because this seems to be more of the inspiration for what Steve and Kit were doing, at least at various times. So Van Frossen associates sentences with sets of truth makers. And truth makers, I'm not going to talk about what they are. For him, they're kind of like, it's not really important what they are. All that's important right now is that there's at least one version of them in which they map one-to-one to propositions. So every distinct truth maker has a distinct proposition in this way of thinking about it. True or false? Yeah, let's say it's true. There's a way of, the preface is there's a way of thinking about it in which that's true. So I'll make that true. I'll go with that. So here you have a mechanism where you think about disjunction, for instance, and this is an idea that really comes back in inquisitive semantics, which I'm not going to talk about. The compositional semantics associates disjunctions of atomic formulas or any complex formulas with the set containing the truth makers of each disjunct. So take like Lena laughed or Cleo cried. That's the set. The proposition Lena laughed, the proposition Cleo cried. So this is really parallel to what's going on in the Ruth focus value. If you think about disjunctions as being a little like a long-winded way of saying having existential quantification, like one person in the set, Cleo or Lena, cried or laughed. I mean, usually we go the other way. But you can see on the parallel, this disjunctive information gives you sets of propositions, conjunctive information, Lena laughed and Cleo cried. Instead of having two propositions, you actually just get one proposition. I put a plus operator. It doesn't matter what that is. That's some kind of operator that takes two propositions or two truth makers and gets you another one that kind of contains both in some way. And we can give different definitions of that. But the point is you don't get different propositions. So this is another just way in which you take a sentence and you get a set of propositions. And it actually has some advantages over the standard ways of writing the Hamblin semantics, Cartoonan semantics, is that you really give it more rules for the composition of these things. We also get false makers, which is a different thing, but I won't talk about. Okay, so what's the Yablovian moment? As I said, there's other world historical events that happen at roughly the same time. So one is the Fenian state revolt. And this is where the states, which are these little parts of the world, well, they didn't exactly get together because they maintained their separateness, and they revolted against the world that they form a part of, and they threw out the worlds entirely, and then there are only states, which is to say he gave us semantics in which he thinks there aren't worlds and not states. And although you can rephrase a lot of what he says in worldly terms, I remember one time talking to him, and he told me that he was worried about Steve's soul, because of Steve's insistence on thinking in terms of worlds. So it's a religious matter, and it's serious. And you can read, there's a lengthy exchange between them in philosophical studies. And then there's also inquisitive semantics, in which, inquisitive semantics, where you also get a similar idea. What do these things all have in common? Well, they're all assigning sets of propositions to sentences in a completely systematic way. And they all happen fairly independently, around the same sort of 5 or 6 year period, 5 or 10 year period, I don't know. So you want to go back to assigning, so there's this general question of, okay, you've got a sentence, what's the set of propositions you want to use to represent kind of what's going on with it in the way that a question has a set of propositions? So Lewis is a bit cagey about this. Well, cagey is the wrong word, but he sort of goes over different options. But the way we standardly read Lewis is the subject matter of a sentence is just the two-celled partition. The partition, so you have a sentence, it's raining, there's two cells. There are the worlds in which it's raining, there's the worlds in which it's not raining. That's the kind of answer that Lewis gives. So the picture on Lewis is, you get these very elaborate subject matters, which I don't know how we get to. We get to them by talking about them, or maybe we express them with questions, or we express them with, often we express them with parts of the world, like the subject matter of like the 17th century, and then it's the partition induced by all the different worlds where different things happen in the 17th century. So he has these sort of non-syntactic routes for getting to subject matters. And then for sentences, he's just like, oh, well, it's either true or it's not, and that's the partition. But we can see, and this is sort of Steve's move, and when I say Steve's moves, I don't mean, he doesn't actually use Hamblin semantics. He only talks about Van Frosten semantics and also has different ways of thinking about which are not Van Frosten-like. But I'm just going to present this, as a kind of like thinking of how our thinking, the general thinking progressed. So if you wanted to do this, as I said, there were a lot of tricks out there that you could use that Lewis didn't use. Although Lewis was probably well aware of some of these at least. So you could use Hamblin semantics in the sort of focus way or in the Kratzer indefinite way to get sets of propositions associated with indefinites in sentences. And you could also use the von Frosten semantics to get a compositional semantics that takes disjunctions and existential quantification to be introducing sets, and then has a whole recursive semantics involving not just truth makers, but false makers as well. I mean, I should say that in his book, Steve gives no single view of the subject matter of sentences. You know, he switches off, as he alluded to in his talk earlier, between sometimes having these recursive definitions, which is what von Frosten's are, sometimes using things just look at the kind of minimal partial assign. Well, if you're doing it in propositional logic, like the minimal assignments that make a sentence true or false, all of those are the truth makers, and minimal assignments make them true, or the truth makers, minimal assignments make them false, or a false maker, partial assignments. And what counts as being true may vary with context. But nonetheless, the basic game is making truth makers available with sentences, and the kind of form of them is pretty similar to the form you'd get in the Hamblin style treatments as extended to things like indefinites. At least first the treatment of indefinites, you get that, you know, you introduce the different ways of making it true that come in there. So that's where this thing sort of fits into that picture. So just to give an example, if you have a sentence like an MP was arrested for a crime, if you were just a straightforward sort of Kratzer Shimeyama adopting their semantics for indefinites, you would get this set of propositions like Angela Rayner was arrested for larceny, Boris Johnson was arrested for manslaughter, Keir Starmer, etc. You'd get all the propositions with all the crimes and all the MPs combined pairwise in that way. And I don't want to say that in either Steve's work or in Kit's work, that's exactly the propositions you get, because I think they think there are mechanisms that are not syntactic generating these things, and it's not just about indefinites and disjunction necessarily. But nonetheless, this is the kind of thing. These are more specific ways, more specific propositions which make that sentence true. They're witnesses for that sentence, and they don't sort of seem to contain excess material. So they kind of follow in the tradition. And I just want to note aspects of this that are more similarities. These notions always have to rely on some kind of atoms in the systems. Like if you're doing propositional logic, it's got to be the particular atomic propositions you have become the atoms out of which you form these sets of propositions. And ways of being true are combinations of atoms in a certain way, where combination is generally conjunction-like, not disjunction-like. That's just kind of built into the system in a way. It's not, I mean, you can motivate it, but it's not something that you derive based on logical strength. And just to sort of put this in the right terminology, the sets of all the ways of being true constitutes the positive subject matter, ways of being false, the negative subject matter. Okay, and this goes along with how Steve was speaking earlier today. You can just phrase this in terms of question. How is this sentence true? How is this sentence false? That's the question expressing the subject matter. Now, this is, I just want to note now that for questions, there's a lot of direct evidence in terms of explaining pretty basic facts about how we read and how we understand sentences that the Hamblin semantics in that rough tradition explains. So the semantics of embedded questions, question-answer congruence, implicatures involving questions. These are kind of explained by the semantics of questions. So a question that I'm kind of always interested in is, okay, we've got this other notion, the sentential subject matter, and I know the motivations why Ruth introduced focus semantics. I know the motivations why Kratzer and Shimeyama introduced existential Hamblin semantics. But you might want to ask, what's the motivation for doing this systematic sentential subject matter? This is really the topic of the book aboutness. But I'm going to kind of focus on, in my sort of blinders for seeing the world, I always kind of try to focus on stuff I think of as sort of quasi linguistic data, or kind of basic intuitions about what sentences entail which sentences, or how we read sentences. I'm sort of want to focus on those for understanding like the motivation for this. In a way, that's because I'm interested in kind of, if you're doing the semantics of natural language in roughly the way linguists and some philosophers do, I'm interested in the question of, should you have sentential subject matters in your kind of basic toolkit? Can you immediately sort of explain what work they're doing? And there's lots of literature on this, so I'm just going to focus on particular things here, particularly the really interesting things that come out in aboutness. So partial truth is one thing. So I had to change. So fascism ended in Western Europe in 1945, you could say, at least at a sort of governmental level. Now I was thinking, oh, maybe Spain's a counterexample to that, but then it turns out, no one who's anyway at all serious thinks of Franco as a fascist at all, because he was too religious, and so I have to have quasi-fascism here. So fascism and quasi-fascism ended in Western Europe in 1945, and in a sense, maybe it's false, but this is one of the big sort of datum I take it Steve's explaining in his book Aboutness is, it's partially correct. If you're not thinking about Spain, and Portugal maybe, it's correct. Here's another kind of example, which is very basic. It's about agreement. Nina thinks Robin and Cleo wore dresses. Mary thinks Robin and Sylvia wore dresses. They agree that Robin wore dresses. That seems like a correct inference. It's a sort of fact about how we think about what agreement is. And then there's explanation of truth or falsity, which I'm not going to talk about right now. So the key notion here to explain these inferences is the notion of aparthood. When is one content a part of another content? And Steve's notion in aboutness, I don't think he's changed it since then, is that X is a part of Y if and only if Y entails X. So entailment is a necessary condition, but also X's subject matter is a part of Y's subject matter. So X doesn't, as it were, change the subject matter. It just talks about something that we were already talking about anyway. Which is a very natural way of thinking about it. I mean, you can think of this as kind of inheriting down from the relevance logic tradition of thinking about, which entailments are kind of relevant. The relevance logic, does its own thing. It doesn't really match up with any set of linguistic judgments I can put together, although it's a nice system. This seems to get some very nice things. So A is a part of A and B, which seems very intuitive, but A or B is not a part of A. So disjuncture introduction doesn't get you a part, even though there's the same entailment relations. So this scheme, combined with the idea of subject matter, then explains some of these linguistic judgments. So that's kind of that's the first thing, especially looking at Steve's particular examples in his book and his discussion. What I was particularly struck with when I was reading the book is, okay, here's this phenomena, things about how we judge when people agree, when people are partly right. And my kind of thought is, well, what are the linguistic tools that we have to use this as a standard sort of, I'm a semanticist. And I was thinking, well, Steve's notion, the sentential subject matter or other variations on that seem like a tool you need. So that's a reason to think that, okay, this should be a standard part of the toolkit in the same way that the semantic values of questions are, or maybe the semantic values of focus are. But I'm going to then question whether I was right in that judgment. But first of all, I just want to make a distinction that I think is helpful, because in fact, I never really made it before, and I felt like my life was less rich without this distinction. And so maybe it's just obvious to all of you, but I'm going to make it and hope that it will enrich your lives as much as it enriched mine. So an internal subject matter, what I'm going to call an internal subject matter, divides up, this is of a sentence, divides up the logical space of a sentence by the ways in which it is true. So that's a Steve kind of subject matter. Or it can divide up the negation as well. So you have all the worlds in which something is true. An internal subject matter is a division of those things in some way. It doesn't have to be a mutually exclusive division, but some kind of division. An external subject matter is the subject a sentence is speaking to, the question it's answering. So that's really the link. If you asked a linguist what's the subject matter of a question, I mean, if they thought that was a legitimate thing to ask them, which is very unlikely, because then this is probably the standard answer you would get. Of course, the external subject matter is just the kind of things you get from the focus structure. So the focus structure, you take a part of the sentence, like, John likes strawberries. You focus John, and you basically erase the content of John and turn it into something like who likes strawberries. That's how you really get the focus structure. And then you get that question. And then the original sentence then answers that question. That's question-answer congruence. So external subject matter then is really the question that's answering, and it can be revealed by the focus structure. And so I just say this is kind of standard linguistic lore. So I mentioned it in my sort of commentary on Steve and Matteo and Spolare. Matteo's going to talk next and maybe give more details of his view, if he's going to talk about that at all here. They pursue this in a lot of detail as a way of understanding kind of subject matter in the same way that Steve is talking about it. So, Venn diagram. So Frida ate pasta. That's external subject matter is kind of different answers to the question that's raised by that. So Frida ate pasta is one answer. Arinza ate pasta is one answer. External doesn't mean you don't cut up the worlds where Frida ate pasta. You can cut up those worlds. You cut them up here, but you cut them up with other answers to the question raised by Frida ate pasta. The internal subject matter is a selective set of entailers of the proposition expressed by a sentence. So roughly speaking, it's ways of being true, it's truth makers. So you divide up the content. So if you have Frida ate pasta, these actually can have intersections if you really want to mix two pastas together, but I thought that might be offensive, so I made it a mutually exclusive. So Frida ate penne, Frida ate spaghetti. These are different ways of eating pasta. And you can divide up whatever parts you want. It doesn't have to be linguistic given, but that's the internal subject matter. So Alex stole the crown. Yeah. Anyway, so I just mentioned some internal, external subject matters here. So I just want to note, so in the hope that this doesn't seem just like so obvious that you're wondering why I'm saying it, I was reading Zoltan's response to, Zoltan Szabo's response to Steve's book in this symposium in Phil Studies, which I hadn't understood at all before. And then it suddenly made sense to me, in that, in my view, Zoltan is just confusing external and internal subject matter because he didn't have the distinction. So sadly, he wasn't at this talk. And so he says here, granted the overall subject matter of Asha is coming to the party and Bella is coming to matter is the same, the question who is coming to the party, then it seemed clear that this question should also be the overall subject matter of the conjunction and the disjunction of these sentences. They too are about who is coming to the party. Forget about the conjunction and disjunction, but just the notion of subject matter he's using in discussing Steve's discussion of subject matter is just so clearly the external notion of subject matter. He's thinking of the subject matter of a sentence as, what's the question this sentence is addressing, not how is it true? And anyway, yeah, it's actually a very interesting paper. There's lots of stuff, and I don't want to sort of criticize the paper, but this is just an argument that you do need this distinction, because there are clearly different ways of dividing up subject matter. I know the linguistic notion, the external subject matter, has a use in that, there's lots of things I think we need to explain to it, just question-answer congruence to begin with, but lots of other things. So the obvious question then is, do we also need the internal subject matter to come some basic observations about how we speak, some basic the kind of data that semanticists are interested in? And that's something I sort of tried to address in my response to Steve, but I don't think I did a very good job. So I'm gonna do another bad job here in the last 5 minutes. Yes. So, as I said, defining parthood is the sort of main thing. Well, is one of the things you can use Steve's subject matter for. There's lots of other things. I should say I'm just skipping a lot of the literature. There's people have especially since Steve and Kit's work, you've seen a lot of linguists and sort of linguist-friendly philosophers use truth-maker semantics to do lots of things. And I don't mean to be giving a judgment on all those things we do. I'm just focusing on this one kind of aspect, the parthood aspect. So there's some really good cases. I've kind of already alluded to them about how this subject matter of conjunction works. So, it's just true on the internal notion of subject matter that the subject matter of A and B, sorry, I have to get this right. I always reverse my directions. The subject matter of A and B includes the subject matter of A. Is that right, or is it the other way around? I hope that's right. Yeah. yeah, the subject matter of A doesn't include the subject matter of A and B. Subject matter of A and B includes the subject matter of A. So that's a good thing, because, let me go back a moment. But the subject matter of A or B, as I said, is not a part of the subject matter of A. So Robin is coming to the party or Lena's tired is not a part of Robin is coming to the party. And that seems to work well with agreement, with judgments of agreement, you know. Sorry, let me just say this right. So that works well with judgments of agreement, because if I'm committed to Robin coming to the party, I don't think if I say Robin came to the party, and a part of what I said is not Robin or Lena came to the party. But this actually does not work well with the external notion of subject matter. The external notion of subject matter essentially brings in, potentially, arbitrary disjuncts into subject matter. If you just use the parted formula that Steve has, this is the kind of like, you know, a main observation about why you want the internal notion, not the external notion, for explaining some of these things about parthood, which relate to judgments about partial truth and agreement. So consider the sentence, Cleo is coming to the party, said relative to the question, who is coming to the party? Well, who is coming to the party also includes, as part of its subject matter, in the subject matter, Lena is coming to the party. So you can, so a part on this, on the scheme of Cleo is coming to the party is Cleo is coming to the party or Lena is coming to the party. And that is not a natural judgment. I mean, it doesn't work with kind of, you know, example data. So here's the thing. Emily thinks a cockroach bit Hilda, Gemma thinks an ant bit Hilda. You can't say they agree a cockroach or an ant bit Hilda. That doesn't seem like a kind of natural inference. Now, maybe that's questionable. That was my, that was my thing. If it's not questionable, then that's further for the external subject matter being right. I'm kind of going back and forth. I actually think like judgments of agreement also depend on external subject matter, but you can see that that's a less good inference than some of the ones involving conjunction. So supposing you're a fan of just using external subject matter, you say, look, you know, maybe this internal subject matter is great when we're talking about explanations of truth or other, you know, funny philosophical things, but I'm just thinking about, you know, kind of how we in everyday normally think about partial content. Do I really need this notion, or can I use something else? And I would just, I'm not going to develop them, but I would say there are other things you could try to do. You can try to use syntactic criteria, not introducing new terms. You can try to do semantic restriction on parts generally, i.e. some kind of non-disjunctive constraint. These things will all involve lots of bells and whistles and complex thinking. But I'm just sort of noting that there are directions you could pursue. If you don't want to have the notion of internal subject matter to explain kind of these linguistic judgments, there's other ways to go. And let me just give one advertisement for going another way, and then I'll be done. So this is something that I also mentioned. I'm so unoriginal. I'm just like still using the same type of examples that I used, you know, 7 years ago or whatever. I can't add either. Okay, so Emily thinks a cockroach bit Hilda. Gemma thinks an ant bit Hilda. So I think it's quite natural to say they agree an insect bit Hilda. So that seems like a relevant agreement. But so that can be good on the external subject matter conception, because if the question is what bit Hilda, an insect bit Hilda is an answer to that question. I mean, you have to have the right notion of answer, where, you know, that is an answer, but you know, those notions exist, and it's an answer entailed by both of the other statements, a cockroach bit Hilda and an ant bit Hilda. So it's something they agree on. So that seems like a good case, as opposed to the potentially bad cases we had before. But I just want to note, this is the kind of case you can't get on the internal conception of subject matter, at least not directly. Because existential generalization, or in fact, it's not just existential generalization, but moving up in kind from cockroach to insect, is not something that you're allowed to do. That's not in the way we build subject matter, that doesn't happen. Because, I mean, just think about it this way. The ways of an insect biting Hilda being true include, like, you know, a grasshopper biting Hilda, but that's not a way of, you know, the other things being true. So Similarly, an ant built Hilda, supposing an ant did bite Hilda, Emma thinks a cockroach built Hilda, then you can say she's right that an insect built Hilda, but you can't say she's right that a cockroach or an ant bit Hilda. That's a kind of natural judgment. So the external subject matter doesn't help you at all, because it seems like the subject matter, cockroach or ant bit Hilda, is as much subject matter as insect bit Hilda, but this is something that neither theory explains naturally. So I'm just going to be like a minute or two. This is the second to last slide. So let me just make some very wishy-washy statements, and then I'll finish. So I presented some judgments, and one thing when you start thinking about these topics is you kind of wonder what your judgments are, what they're getting at. I guess I started with the view that, oh, these are clear judgments that are getting at kind of content parthood, and the theory, you find in aboundness is going to be a good theory to explain it. Maybe it has some problems. I've now come to think that this stuff is a lot messier. There's something like parthood might be one way of facilitating these judgments. Kind of every time you have a part in the internal Yablovian sense, you do get an entailment. I've never seen I haven't seen any kind of examples of that. But it seems like there's other ways of getting what I'll kind of call immediate entailments, like what you get between an ant built Hilda to an insect built Hilda. And I think there's lots of different reasons you might get them. I mean, sometimes existential generalization, as Steve pointed out somewhere, doesn't involve introducing any new non-logical terms, so it looks quite good in that respect. He had a cool word for what that was, but I've forgotten it. And even when you do introduce a new term, like ant to insect, it might just be that term is kind of acceptable as sort of in a kind of real, it has to do with psychological facts about what we take to be kind of like relevant information here. So I've come to think that there's sort of multiple routes, not just parthood, to the kind of judgments that you find in agreement and in she's partially right about things, not just parthood. Now, so my verdict is kind of, first of all, I'm not qualified to make a verdict here, but just I kind of have a question mark on whether you need internal subject matter to understand this sort of body of judgments we make that relate to parthood, that Steve quite helpfully in his book sort of points out a lot of different examples that push the same way. I think it's still like an interesting natural topic to kind of figure out like what you really need here. Unfortunately, it probably hinges on quite kind of eccentric bits about the psychology of reasoning, so it's not the kind of neat story you might help. And it's still, it's clear that the notion of internal subject matter is cutting at something very natural and interesting to think about. It's not so clear like how much it's part of the field kit, and I think it's just these things like one just has to have it as kind of like the kind of extra field kit or that you kind of keep on having on the side as something, oh, maybe I could use that, and then we'll see how much can it be used. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much.